She's a murderer!
It was my mother-in-law who shouted this and lunged at me. I instinctively dodged, and my mother-in-law furiously banged on the hospital room door. I was at the hospital because I had been summoned by my mother-in-law just moments ago. She had told me to hurry and come because my husband had been in a car accident. I had rushed over in response to her call, so why was she treating me like this?
What happened? What do you mean?
I shouted, keeping my distance from my mother-in-law.
You pushed my son into the road, didn't you?
I was momentarily stunned by my mother-in-law's words, but I vehemently denied it.
I did no such thing. Who told you such nonsense?
Hearing my words, my mother-in-law smirked. Just as I was wondering why, a voice came from behind me.
It was me. Pretty bold of you to call it nonsense after pushing someone.
The voice came from my husband, lying in the bed. Both his legs were bandaged, and he was looking at me with utter contempt. My name is Jennifer. I am a 27-year-old homemaker. Before getting married, I used to work as a secretary in a small company, and I met my husband, Robert, through a mutual friend. My husband and I are the same age. He worked in a different company in the same industry, and we hit it off talking about our jobs from the very beginning. After a while, my husband proposed to me, and I resigned from my job to move closer to him. My husband lived with his parents, so we had to look for a new place for us. However, we couldn't find a suitable place that we both liked, and my husband said, "I know it's a bit sudden, but I've always thought it would be nice if we could live with my mom, who's not in the best of health, at my parents' home. Of course, it would have been best if we found a good place on our own. My mom isn't forcing us, but she did mention it would make her happy. So, please, can we?" Realizing his intentions, I noticed that my husband probably never really wanted to find a new place for just the two of us. Still, I felt my husband was trying not to impose this on me right away. I was uneasy about living with my mother-in-law so early into our marriage. However, when we visited his parents' house to introduce ourselves before getting married, I got the impression that my mother-in-law was a kind and cheerful woman. Additionally, there weren't many homes as grand and well located as theirs. I told my husband, "All right, I get it. But remember, I'm not familiar with your mom or how things work in your house. So you need to guide and advise me a lot, okay?" Then my husband said with a smile, "Of course. We'll work together, I promise." So, I agreed to move in with him. From the start of our life there, my mother-in-law said, "Don't be too nervous, Jennifer. You're like a daughter to me, so feel at ease." Since my mother-in-law wasn't very healthy, I took over most of the household chores. Their house was big, making cleaning quite a chore. But I did my best to keep it spotless every day. I also made an effort to cook meals, especially for my mother-in-law. Thanks to that, my mother-in-law often said, "Jennifer, your dishes are always so delicious. I'm so happy to have you as my daughter-in-law." Finishing every bite. With every passing day, my initial nervousness started to fade. However, an incident soon shook the harmonious living situation with my mother-in-law. One day, as I was serving dinner to my mother-in-law as usual, she took a bite and murmured, "The flavor is a bit strong today." That evening's meal was beef stew. I hadn't changed the seasoning at all from what I usually do. Puzzled, I quickly replied, "I'm sorry, maybe I added a tad too much salt today." My mother-in-law responded with her usual smile, "Don't worry about it. It's still tasty." That put my mind at ease for the moment. I remembered reading somewhere that when you're tired, you tend to season your food more heavily. So I thought to myself, am I that exhausted? Maybe I should go to bed early tonight. And so, I hit the hay earlier than usual. But from that day on, every time I served a meal, my once cheerful mother-in-law seemed to become upset. Meal times started to become stressful for me, and I began to walk on eggshells around her. A few days later, to add insult to injury, she snapped at me. "If you keep serving this salty food, I'm gonna get sick. Are you trying to shorten my life?" I had never been yelled at like this as an adult. I was dumbfounded. Stumbling over my words, I apologized. I thought it was the usual seasoning. I'm sorry. I'll try to make it less salty next time. Such incidents became almost a daily occurrence. At that time, I was the one being allowed to live here. So, if I didn't listen to my mother-in-law, I might have been kicked out of the house. It'd be a real mess if that happened without having another place lined up or any preparations made. So, I decided to look for another place to live while also saving up some moving expenses. Until then, thinking it would benefit me in the long run, I decided to improve my cooking skills. Every day, I would search online, buy books on low-sodium diets, and read them. Considering my mother-in-law's health, I cut back on the salt, added more variety to the dishes, and researched meals with balanced nutrition, actually cooking them. Yet, despite my best efforts, my mother-in-law's tone only got harsher. She even went as far as saying things like,
"Any woman who can't cook better than this is worthless. You're a failure as a daughter-in-law."
Around this time, my mother-in-law started to subtly monitor my actions. She'd swipe her finger across the floor I had just cleaned and say things like, "This cleanliness is about a C+. Maybe you should clean it one more time?" Even when I just went out to do some shopping or to grab something from a convenience store, she'd fret.
"Don't go out alone. Are you planning on running away?"
Every time I left the house, I'd reassure her. "I promise, I'm not going anywhere. Please, just relax." However, for a while, my words didn't seem to help, and my mother-in-law began watching me almost constantly. It left me with no free time for myself. However, those days suddenly came to an end just a few months later. One day, my mother-in-law said, "Jennifer, I'm not gonna comment on your actions anymore. It's been making things awkward between us." And she told me this with a warm smile. I was taken aback and replied, "Really? I'm glad to have earned your trust." While I was relieved, considering her previous obsession, I couldn't genuinely be happy about this change in her. I started to suspect my mother-in-law was watching me in some other way. Sure enough, my hunch was spot on. After some digging, I discovered that my mother-in-law had secretly placed a GPS tracker on me. In this day and age, it seems there are ways for someone to put a GPS on another without their knowledge, and it scared me. I felt like I was at my breaking point, but even if I confronted her in anger, I couldn't deactivate the GPS without confiscating my mother-in-law's phone. I hoped that if I talked to my husband about it, he would say that tracking me with GPS was over the line. So, one night after my mother-in-law went to bed, I said to him,
"All day, while you're at work, I feel like your mom is watching everything I do. I used to get compliments on my housework, but now she grades every little thing I do and even berates me sometimes. I'm working just as hard as I used to. The constant surveillance from the GPS is really getting to me. I haven't been able to relax at all lately."
However, Robert just replied, "Maybe she put the GPS on you because you're sloppy with your chores. You should realize your own shortcomings." He defended her. I was dumbfounded and close to snapping. But, since my mother-in-law was sleeping in her bedroom, I couldn't start an argument. It dawned on me that I had no allies in this house. The only person I could confide in was a close friend from my hometown. Occasionally, we'd exchange messages, and that's how I'd relieve some of the stress. My parents were too busy to help, and their house is quite a distance from here. From that day, my communication with my husband dwindled significantly. One day, before heading to work, my husband casually mentioned, "Work is gonna be crazy for a while. There's a promotion on the line, so I won't be coming home for a while." With my husband gone for a while, it'd just be me and my mother-in-law. Honestly, living with my mother-in-law, who constantly monitors and criticizes everything I do, feels daunting. But I can't leave my mother-in-law alone since she has health issues and occasionally needs assistance. I resolved to endure it until my husband returns. If my mother-in-law's snide comments don't cease, when my husband returns, I decided I'll tell him strongly. I can't take it anymore mentally. I might leave. As I was thinking about this, the next day, my mother-in-law asked me to do some shopping for her. "Jennifer, could you go to the supermarket in the next town over? They have a sale on toilet paper today." My mother-in-law showed me a map and pointed out the supermarket she was referring to. It would take about an hour on foot to reach this supermarket. However, we usually get our toilet paper from a nearby store, and the price isn't different. I wondered why she wanted me to buy from that specific store and was momentarily at a loss for words. My mother-in-law then urged,
Come on! They might run out, hurry! If we miss today, we can't get it at that price. This brand is exclusive to that store, and it's been highly recommended by the neighbors. So please, get going!
And with that, she turned on the TV. I let out a silent sigh, so my mother-in-law wouldn't notice. If I were to say,
Come on, they have toilet paper at the supermarket I always go to. I don't want to go that far.
She'd probably get even more upset than usual. While I thought it was a hassle to go, the idea of being away from my mother-in-law for an extended period due to the supermarket's distance made me feel a bit relieved. To diffuse the tense atmosphere, I chuckled.
I've never been to that store, and I have a terrible sense of direction. But I'll try following the map.
And left the house without making her upset. What am I doing every day? After finished shopping and on my way home, I inadvertently muttered to myself. That's when my cell phone rang. It was my mother-in-law.
You took so long shopping!
Thinking she'd scold me for that, I nervously answered the call. However, my assumption was entirely wrong. As soon as I answered, my mother-in-law hastily said,
Robert's been in an accident and is in the hospital. He's in critical condition. Come immediately.
This caught me off guard, and my mind was racing.
Wait, Robert's hospitalized?
That's all I could muster. Though I wanted to ask more, my mother-in-law hung up abruptly. Without being able to get more details, my anxiety only continued to grow. All I knew was that my husband had a severe injury that required hospitalization. Was he in a life-threatening condition? Or was he bedridden and unable to communicate? Lost in these thoughts, I felt distant from reality on my way to the hospital. After what felt like hours, praying he was okay, I hesitantly opened the door to my husband's room. Spotting Robert lying on the bed, I shouted,
Robert! Are you okay?
I rushed over to my husband. As for my husband seemed to be conscious. But my husband avoided my eyes. Just when I was pondering this, my mother-in-law suddenly stood up and yelled at me.
Robert has broken both his legs badly. It's all because of you. What are you gonna do about it?
What? Me? I had no clue about the incident and stood there dumbfounded. My husband then looked at me with a sneer.
Don't play dumb. I was on a field job, and suddenly you pushed me from behind. I got thrown onto the road and got hit by a motorcycle because of you.
Incredibly, even the victim, Robert, was blaming me.
I didn't do anything.
Though I tried to deny desperately, my mother-in-law told me.
Enough of your noise! How many times do I have to say it? You're the culprit. Admit it. What you did is just like murder. So, pay for the medical bills and emotional suffering he has, and get a divorce. You wretched woman!
Despite being innocent, being treated as a culprit was unbearable. I asserted.
Wait a minute! No matter how you think about it, I didn't do anything. I wasn't even at the scene, and I didn't know Robert's work schedule or his days off.
I had to avoid being treated as guilty at all costs. At that moment, police officers and a woman entered the room. The officers greeted my husband and went to talk to the attending doctor. The remaining woman looked at me, her face registering recognition.
Thank you so much earlier.
I'm sorry for barging in like this. My apologies for the late introduction. My name is Smith. I'm actually Robert's supervisor. I came to visit and hear the story, she said, reaching out to me and giving a courteous greeting. My husband's eyes widened.
What?
You know her? He exclaimed. I gave Robert a nod and said, well, sort of. Then looked over at Mrs. Smith. Actually, this morning, I noticed something my husband had forgotten. My goodness. I need to deliver this right away. What my husband forgot was, incredibly, the key to the company car. I remembered my husband mentioning he occasionally brings it home, the key for the car he uses for work. I tried to call my husband right away but couldn't get through. I decided to go to the company and deliver it personally. And when I hurriedly brought the key to the office, the woman who assisted me was Mrs. Smith. Unaware of all this, my husband pointed at me and said to Mrs. Smith, "Mrs. Smith, you might want to avoid dealing with her. She's really no good, the worst, actually." Remaining composed, Mrs. Smith asked my husband, "Why do you think so?" He began fervently.
"Because it's all her fault I'm hurt this bad. I was out and about when she suddenly pushed me from behind, and I ended up in the road. To top it all off, I got hit by a motorcycle."
Mrs. Smith responded with sympathy. "That sounds awful." But my husband continued, seeking more pity.
"Exactly. I was just about to have lunch, looking up a nice place to eat around noon, and then this happened. It's the worst."
Mrs. Smith's expression suddenly turned stern. She glared at my husband and said, "That's odd. Your wife was at our office around that time, delivering the company car key you forgot. Your story doesn't add up." Continuing with a fierce look, Mrs. Smith told my husband,
"And this key, isn't it a duplicate? All of the company car keys are accounted for. There's no record of this car having 2 keys. Why was this key at your home?"
My husband's face turned a shade of blue. He stammered,
Maybe I got mixed up because of the accident? I don't remember anything about the key. Could you ask someone from HR instead?"
Mrs. Smith firmly retorted,
"We won't let you play dumb. Key duplication is a serious matter for the company. We wouldn't come to you without investigating first. We already talked to Ms. Anderson from HR."
Upon hearing this, my husband, with a look of realization, blurted out,
"Please stop this, especially in front of my wife. I admit I duplicated the key."
Feeling uneasy, I said to Mrs. Smith, "Could you explain in detail? I'd really appreciate it." Mrs. Smith replied, "Of course. This might be hard for you to hear, Jennifer. But I believe it's worse to keep things hidden. Our investigation has found that your husband was using the company car to meet with Ms. Anderson." Realizing the gravity of the situation, I turned to my husband and shouted,
"What? You've been having an affair?"
He kept making excuses. "Maybe someone impersonated me and used the car? Maybe they set me up by putting the key in my bag?" Proud of his ingenious idea, my husband looked smug. But Mrs. Smith sighed deeply. "We checked the dashcam footage. It was definitely you and Ms. Anderson in the car, getting cozy. Would you like your wife to see it too?" Confronted with this evidence, my husband clenched his teeth, took a deep breath, and finally admitted to the affair. Mrs. Smith said to my husband, "We'll inform you about your disciplinary actions later. But don't even think about getting a promotion. In fact, brace yourself for a demotion." Panicking, my husband begged,
"Please, Mrs. Smith. Not a demotion. Look at my leg. I have medical bills coming up."
But Mrs. Smith didn't budge.
"Using the company car for personal reasons, especially an affair, and your leg injury are 2 separate issues."
At that moment, the police returned to the hospital room. They explained to Mrs. Smith and I, "Sorry for the wait. From our investigations, it's confirmed that Robert was indeed pushed onto the road and fractured his leg." Hearing this, my husband, who was sobbing just moments before, smirked and said confidently,
"See? I told you. Jennifer pushed me. You better fess up, Jennifer. Lying will only get you in deeper trouble."
The police looked puzzled. "Wait, I never said your wife pushed you. We've identified the suspect from the security camera footage." At that moment, my mother-in-law suddenly became noticeably restless. My mother-in-law said,
"Oh, come on. We don't need to watch the security footage. My son himself said that it was Jennifer who pushed him. Isn't that the best proof?"
she added, laughing overly loud and obviously fake. The police responded with a straight face. Ma'am, don't play dumb. We've confirmed through the footage that you were the one who pushed him. Your son didn't have time to look back after he was pushed and was immediately hit by a motorcycle. We will need to confirm this with your son himself. Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law, realizing she couldn't escape blame, brazenly admitted.
Fine, I pushed my son. So what?
I couldn't contain my anger any longer and exclaimed.
You made your own son have an accident and then tried to blame me? That's really despicable. How could you do such a thing?
My mother-in-law, unfazed, said to me. I just didn't want to get caught, you see? I made you go out far so I could pin the blame on you. Made sure there was no inconsistency like you being home when the accident happened, right? She spoke with an innocent look on her face. Both Mrs. Smith and I were speechless. Seeing my mother-in-law's attitude, my husband was visibly shocked, realizing the truth that his own mother had tried to kill him. Overwhelmed, he began to lose his temper, shouting.
Mom! What the heck? Aren't you gonna say it wasn't you? Why? Explain!
The police had to restrain him as he seemed like he might get violent. Even when restrained, he wouldn't stop talking. Robert shouted.
Jennifer! I'm sorry for cheating. You don't have to do chores or take care of my mother anymore. From now on, this damn old woman will do everything.
My mother-in-law, although frightened, just shook her head. Seeing this, my husband got even angrier.
What? You old bat! I won't let you get away with saying you can't do it. Before Jennifer came, you used to give me an allowance and did all the housework, right? I can't work with this body now, so you better work, even if you have to crawl.
I was stunned, but my mother-in-law said through tears. This is Robert's true nature. I had been taking care of his daily needs while enduring his daily verbal abuse. I thought that when you came into his life, I'd finally be free from this life. Even though I couldn't really sympathize with my mother-in-law after hearing this, I did feel a bit sorry for her. I had no intention of helping my mother-in-law or continuing to live in that family home. Even watching her son being restrained by the police, my mother-in-law maintained a cold expression and shared. I have a grudge against you, Robert. You are always been harsh with me, treating me like a slave before you got married. You wasted money on gambling and then yelled at me to work harder. Despite me doing all the house chores and cooking, you only ever complained, never helped out. I had hoped you might change after marriage, but seeing your attitude towards Jennifer, I knew you wouldn't. I was afraid of what you might do to me if I warned Jennifer about you. I thought maybe Jennifer would get fed up and leave, and then I'd have to bear the brunt of your wrath. My health has been deteriorating, so I started to fear your presence. Before I knew it, I had pushed you onto the road. My mother-in-law continued to pour out her grievances, hoping the police would sympathize with her, detailing how violent and domineering her son had been. My mother-in-law never stopped talking, so under police direction, Mr. Smith and I left the hospital. In the end, my mother-in-law was arrested for attempted murder. There were various circumstances, like the mother and son matter, and my husband treated my mother-in-law horribly. However, because my mother-in-law had a clear intent to kill my husband, she couldn't avoid arrest. Even when she was arrested, my mother-in-law showed no resistance. Instead, she exclaimed with tears of joy, "If it means getting away from Robert, I'm glad to go to prison. Finally, I'm free from this painful life." Living in that family home had its own set of challenges for me as well. Given that my husband had been unfaithful, I couldn't continue to live with him, and with my mother-in-law out of the picture, I had no reason to stay in that family home. So, I packed my things and quickly left the family home before my husband could be discharged from the hospital. While my husband was a victim and wasn't arrested. But he was demoted for making unauthorized copies of company car keys and having an affair with a junior employee. On top of that, he had been embezzling funds by claiming personal dinner dates as business expenses, which led to his termination. Naturally, he received no severance pay. He even faced claims for the financial damages he caused the company. My husband complained to his employer, saying,
"Wait a minute! I've been working here since I graduated, and you're not gonna give me a dime? What a terrible company! I don't need a job like this.
He apparently didn't realize the gravity of his misdeeds. My husband was gonna marry his mistress, but the other hand, Ms. Anderson didn't want to take care of my husband after he broke both his legs, and she said she didn't need an unemployed man and took off. So, he ended up being all alone. I divorced my husband. I made sure to claim emotional sufferings they caused from both my husband and Ms. Anderson. I kept his contact until he paid the full amount, during which I received emails almost daily where he'd say things like,
I'm sorry. I'll reflect on my actions. I wish we could start over.
I felt threatened, so I blocked his contact once everything was settled. As for me, I found a new home, told my situation, and returned to my old job. Although I had once resigned, everyone at the workplace warmly welcomed me back. Since I don't have children, I decided to immerse myself in my work and further my career. I'm living my life sincerely every day.